Hello there. Okay, I'm going to make three short lectures for you on a book that Friedrich Nietzsche wrote called Beyond Good and Evil. And the subtitle of that book is called Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. So I think, given our time constraints, it would be best to focus just on the preface of that book and chapter 5. I asked you to buy the whole book because with this introduction that I'll give on the preface and on chapter 5, I think you'll be left with enough um, information to be able to continue with the book on your own sometime in the future. So I don't feel too guilty about having you buy the book. So the preface Nietzsche wrote some years after he wrote the book. Now, before we begin, before I begin talking about the preface, and then I'll make two lectures on chapter 5. Chapter 5 is called On the Natural History of Morals. So we're going to focus on Nietzsche's moral philosophy. Of all the different disciplines within Nietzsche's corpus, of all the themes, Nietzsche spent the most time in moral philosophy, and he's most mature and best at that. Nietzsche is one of the great thinkers of our Western tradition. I think he's one of the great thinkers of the 19th century. I would put him in terms of influence with Freud and Charles Darwin as the three most influential persons. Oh, maybe I would include Karl Marx in those four. Um, People from the 20th century who are so influential. So there's a question that Nietzsche raises that I find completely absent in the history of philosophy before Nietzsche and even after Nietzsche. And this is the question of the future evolution of the human species. Now, there's talk about that in the other disciplines, for example, among the scientists and environmentalists and anthropologists. I would call that the discipline that deals with that perhaps um, evolutionary anthropology. But it would have to be a complete rethinking and recasting of the concepts of evolutionary anthropology. Anthropology, as you know, is the study of humans, anthropoi. And there's philosophical anthropology, which is a philosophical approach to human nature. And we have courses throughout the world on philosophical anthropology. Some people call it philosophy of human nature. We call it that here at Walsh University. But this question, the way Nietzsche formulates it, is uniquely Nietzschean. I found little tidbits here and there, but nothing coming from a great thinker like Nietzsche on the future history of the human species. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, there's been a lot of thought about the past of the human species. That's what history is all about. And then we have histories of all the subject matters. And then there's history, the deeds and words and forces that have caused the changes in our human world throughout, from the beginnings of history with Herodotus till now. And every discipline has its own history also. But Nietzsche is talking about the future evolution of the human species, the future of our evolution. And that's all tied up with, that's my dog coughing. She's old. She has chronic cough. So the future history of the human species, that's a big question. And I've never seen anyone raise that question in a deep way other than Nietzsche. And it's all tied up with morality. There's a quote by Nietzsche that says, where Nietzsche says, the question of morality is of the utmost importance to me because the future evolution of the human species depends on it. So, depending on what morality becomes predominant for a people, and now that we're moving into a sort of global mentality, which is dominated by Western European mentality, then the particular morality that dominates is going to shape human nature simply for, for many reasons. Um, because when we act in a particular way habitually, then that shapes human character. And if that goes on for some time, then human nature itself begins to change. So human nature has not been so one of the big things that Nietzsche is developing here is that human nature is malleable, it's changeable. There are types of people who become predominant and they dominate and they set the standard and they're the opinion makers and everyone else sort of aspires towards that. So the big point that I'm making now is the connection between morality and the future evolution of the human species. So what matters most for Nietzsche is that philosophy begin to rule over religion and over science. Now, it doesn't mean philosophy is going to tell religion what to do and what science should do. It's just that philosophy should be in a ruling position in terms of legislating values. So, for Nietzsche, philosophy is what matters most in Western civilization because it's primarily concerned with the future evolution of the human species. Western philosophy, he maintains in his famous preface to Beyond Good and Evil, has two outstanding features. On the one hand, and this is the big point that he brings out in the preface is very short, but I want you to read the preface, think about it, because it creates a structure for the whole of Beyond Good and Evil, all the chapters of Beyond Good and Evil. We're only going to study one, namely chapter 5. So we have millennia of dogmatic Platonism. We need to talk about that because those words just are empty unless you've studied the history of philosophy somewhat. Millennia, that means thousands of years from the time of Plato, but not Plato's philosophy only, but a particular spirit that has grown out of Plato's philosophy, Nietzsche calls Platonism. Now, Platonism is a predominant school of thought within philosophy. It's called Platonic idealism. And along with the Aristotelian school and other traditions as well, has influenced the most on Western understanding of values. Okay? So we have thousands of years of what he calls dogmatic Platonism. Now, when Nietzsche's talking about dogmatic Platonism in this chapter, in the preface of Beyond Good and Evil, he has a particular thing in mind. He has not only Plato's philosophy, but 2,500 years of a particular school of thought that's working with other schools of thought, of course, but a predominant school of thought, perhaps the most predominant school of thought in our Western tradition, Platonic idealism. And even when it doesn't take the form of idealism, it still has Platonic structure to it. And the main thing that he's focusing on here with this dogmatic Platonism is this hierarchy and this two-world view of reality, where there's a bifurcation, a splitting between spirit and nature. This is a very big idea. Probably, in my understanding, this is probably the most profound, the deepest, the most comprehensive and far-reaching insight that one can think of in terms of the history of Western culture and civilization. What is that? That it's been dominated by 2,500 years of a particular sensibility. Now, it takes on different forms depending, when you're reading Rene Descartes, who's the father of modern philosophy, and he's a rationalist. Still, these structures are there, but in different forms. So he calls it dogmatic Platonism. Platonism in this context means metaphysical dualism, that is, a split between spirit and nature. So instead of seeing all natural things as spiritual and all spiritual things as having a body, what Western philosophy has done in following Plato is separate the two materials, two substances. There's pure spirit. Okay? By pure, they mean unmixed with anything material or corporeal, incorporeal. So spirit is pure in the sense that it's without body, without matter. And that's usually put above what? The material world, which is despiritualized. There's nothing spiritual about the material world. So, for example, when we look at the world through the optics of science, there's nothing spiritual about it. There is something spiritual about it, but through the purview of science, and I'm talking about the most sophisticated science, then there's nothing spiritual because science doesn't investigate spiritual matters. It objectifies the world, makes reality into an object standing before the pure subject. So Nietzsche sees this as dogmatic. Now, by dogmatic, you've probably heard the word dogmatic. When somebody is being dogmatic, it means that they're making a claim that they really have no support for that claim. They really can't support that claim against strong, deep criticism. So dogmatism means I have everything all figured out. And so all these philosophical systems that have preceded us, from Plato all the way to Nietzsche, many of the philosophers create systems where they explain everything. And they claim this is the truth. This is the truth. But then somebody else creates another system and they claim this is the truth. And somebody else claims theirs is the truth. Well, what do we have? We have a bunch of schools of thought, each one claiming that they're the truth. So that's called dogmatism. In Platonism, it means more than this, but this is the main thing that it means for Nietzsche in this context. And all words have to be returned to context. Whenever we talk about anything, key ideas, expressions, words, always return them to who said it and in the context of what it's of who said it. In context is the key. So in this, I'm just trying to tell you what I think Nietzsche has in mind when he wrote this preface, and he talks about millennia of dogmatic Platonism. He means ever since Plato until 1885, when he's writing, which is the present of his time, and which we could include now because we're talking about huge sweeps of time. So not much difference between 1885 and 2021, with the exception of the explosion of technology, and that was the big shift from the 19th to the 20th, and from the 20th to the 21st century. The emphasis on and sophistication of the technology. So you have that going on for 2,500 years. What? This two-world metaphysics where spirit is elevated above nature. Now, it's not just spirit and nature. One could go on and make this bifurcation into many, many different forms, but that's the main form. It's pure spirit put above nature. So nature is corporeal, pure spirit is incorporeal. Now, Nietzsche's point here is that there's a value judgment being made, that spirit, pure spirit, is greater and higher and better than nature. And then nature is despiritualized. Instead of seeing the spiritualization of sensuality, we have the bifurcation of nature and spirit. But the bifurcation goes on and on. One could put God if we were to draw a line across the blackboard, for example, on the top of the line, you would put the supra-sensuous. That is the beyond the sensuous, the metaphysical. Meta means beyond, physical means matter. That goes on top of the line. God would go on top of the line. Pure spirit would go on top of the line. The good in itself would go on top of the line. Um Absolute truth would go on top of the line. Unchanging being would go on top of the line. Eternity would go on top of the line. Uh, the beyond would go on top of the line. Ultimate reality, which is unchanging, would go on top of the line. So we have this line, then all these things on top of the line. But the main thing is the supra-sensuous spirit, pure spirit. Then below the line, put all the opposites. Instead of eternity, put time. Instead of being, put becoming. Instead of one absolute truth, put perspectivism. Instead of some unchanging reality, put becoming. Instead of being, put becoming on the bottom of the line. Put time on the bottom of the line. Put perspective on the bottom of the line. Put animality in the bottom of the line. So eventually you'd have this line across the blackboard, and all these things would be on the top of the line, and all these things on the bottom of the line. All the things on the top of the line are called the suprasensuous. That's reality, according to Plato and according to Western philosophy. Whatever is unchanging is real. That's why we're obsessed with measuring everything. And then on the bottom of the line, you have time, all the main qualities of human existence that we face in our daily lives. Now, Nietzsche's point is that there's a value judgment being made, that everything on top of the line is more real than the bottom of the line. And not only more real, but of infinite more worth, more value. So a value judgment is being made. So by separating the suprasensuous from the sensuous, we've already denigrated the sensuous. We've denigrated time. We've denigrated the material world, the natural world. This is big, right? The denigration of the body, of sexuality, of passions, of the five senses. Sex, which is the origin of all life. If we besmirch that, we besmirch the origin of life. So Nietzsche thinking that this elevation of the suprasensuous above the sensuous contains within it already resentment against life. Okay, this is the big insight. And so the future evolution of the human species, if it's going to evolve, it has to overcome metaphysical dualism. And we've been with it for 2,500 years. See, one of the things I've learned over the years, now I'm this old man and I've studied philosophy since I was a young man. One of the things that's dawned on me, and I became pretty good at, is seeing how these philosophical ideas, when they become predominant, they seep into the consciousness of people, and that just people who've never studied philosophy. For example, here's an example. Nowadays, animals have very few rights. Animals don't have rights. And so we have animal liberation, animal rights people, and so on, trying to protest against that and so on. There's controversy about it. But the metaphysical view about animals is that only humans have a soul. That comes right out of Christian theology, that only humans have a soul. Okay? So if only humans have a soul, then all non-human animals don't have a soul. Okay, if they don't have a soul, then they have no rights. So you can do whatever you want to your animal, unless it's overt cruelty, and then somebody's just so appalled they find some kind of law. But the laws are so slack, you can do whatever you want to your animal. I see it all the time. So that's an example. That animals have no rights because they have no soul. Well, who said animals have no soul? Well, 2,500 years of dogmatic Platonism said so. And so it seeps into our consciousness, seeps into our laws, and so animals have no rights. So we have chicken factories where you have 9 chickens growing in 2 feet of where their feet grow into the mesh, and they're just harvested as though they were string beans, and nobody thinks twice of it. Do you see how that works? So it's not just with the animals, but many things. The the philosophy that predominates for a long time, it seeps in. Uh, it's like a trickle down effect. There's no trickle down economics that I've ever seen. But the values, and then what people do, since everybody's just trying to put meat on the table, feed themselves, and get to the next, and going from check to check, and the economic pressures and the pressures of life are just so great. Nobody has time to think about 2,000 years of dogmatic Platonism and the future evolution of the human species. They're trying to put food on their table and trying to get their kids to college. No one has time to think or anything. So they just appropriate. They do what they can. You're in survival mode mostly. Everyone is, and so there's no leisure hardly left. So what's left? Just appropriate the opinions and values that happen to be going on at the time, and those become mine. I don't have time to think about these. What is, do animals have a soul or something? There's no time for that. I have to change, I have to pay my bills, right? Not me personally, I'm just talking about the average person. So that's okay, so that's one big giant thing going on in Western civilization. The triumph of dogmatic Platonism. Now there's another thing to this. Dogmatic Platonism has also grafted itself onto Christianity. Now, if you think about morals, we haven't been really focusing on that, but if you think about it, most of everyone's morals come from their religion. Okay, philosophy doesn't really shape people's morals that much, although it does trickle down here and there. But when it comes to moral philosophy, most people don't sit around and read moral philosophy. At most, they go to church on Sunday, or some Sundays, or some holidays, and they, or from their parents who are religious, and their morality comes from the religion. Now, that's something Nietzsche is going to consider in his approach to morality, about the connection with religion. So this dogmatic Platonism is not just the philosophies that have followed the particular assumptions given to us by Plato and then handed down throughout the millennia. It's also Christianity that's become Platonized. Okay, there's many things that have never been taught by Christ, but since Plato influenced theology so much, when the theologians got a hold of the Bible and the texts and making sense of the text, they read the meaning of those texts through the optics of dogmatic Platonism. A good example of that would be Saint Francis, a saint of whom I've done some, that I love and done some work on. There's Saint Bonaventure, who wrote on Saint Francis, but Saint Bonaventure was a Platonist. So when you read Saint Bonaventure on Saint Francis, what you're getting is a Platonized version of Saint Francis. The very one who loved nature so much, if you read Saint Bonaventure on Saint Francis, and Francis didn't write much, so we have to look to these other traditions to try to find, what he said. Otherwise, we have very, very little that he wrote. Then we have a Platonized version of Saint Francis, who elevates spirit above nature and doesn't see nature as part of God, the God, and that's just not part of his whole thing, was to see nature as part of divinity. So that's another example of how Saint Bonaventure, who was a Platonist, influenced our interpretation of Saint Francis, who is the most natural, loving philosopher that we have, and turned him into a nature denigrator. So without knowledge of this dogmatic Platonism dominating Western civilization, it's hard to sift through the history of philosophy without seeing it from the perspective of dogmatic Platonism. Dogmatism, it simply means there's a claim being made without any sufficient rational rationale and proof for those claims. It's an illegitimate claim, in other words, when somebody is being a dogmatic. Now, what's happened though, since the dawning of modern times, with the dawning of the Enlightenment, now we have the beginnings of modern science and the foundations of modern science. There's been warfare, as he calls it, against this 2,500 years of Platonism. So you have this incredible uh, um, tension that's being generated in 1885 that Nietzsche sees. And as far as I can see, the tension's just mounted even more. What's the tension? Excuse me. What is this tension? The tension is between 2,500 years of dogmatic Platonism with this two-world metaphysics that I'm talking about, and with it, the resentment against life, which Nietzsche unmasks. And then you have hundreds of years, ever since maybe the late 1700s, with the dawning of the Enlightenment. We have the rise of modern science and uh, certain philosophies that place into question the legitimacy of this two-world metaphysics, of God as pure spirit, as eternity above time, being above becoming, spirit above nature, the supra-sensuous exalted above the sensuous, and separating these two. There's been this counterforce against it, and it's science, modern science, and contemporary philosophy, which are moving to overcome metaphysical dualism. So you have this incredible, it's almost like a bow, you know. In fact, this is the metaphor that Nietzsche uses. He says like it's created this tremendous tension, like a bow, and he wants to put an arrow in that bow. So what is the tension? Well, what's pulling this way is the counterforce against dogmatic Platonism. What's pulling this way on the bow is 2,500 years of Platonism. So as we pull more and more and more, it's creating more and more tension. Now, if there's an arrow there and a goal, a bullseye, then just have to let go. And that arrow will take off towards the bullseye, right? So we need to find out, what is the arrow, what is the bullseye, what is the tension. The arrow is humanity. The bullseye is the overcoming of metaphysical dualism. And the goal is the production of a being that's higher than humans, the Ubermensch, the overhuman. Now, it sounds so bizarre, because what is this Ubermensch? Well, we can talk about it, but for now, just think of it as a type of human being who's gracefully matured out of this tension and has evolved to a point where they overcome this resentment towards life, and it begins to generate types of people who are saying yes to this life, to the moment, living mindfully, affirmatively, and generate in the moment, saying yes to life instead of a no to life. At the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy is this moral philosophy, especially this yes to life. There are a lot of negations of life that look like affirmations, but they're really negations. And there are also affirmations that look like negations, like when you're being critical of something, like when Nietzsche's criticizing dogmatic Platonism. Critique, that's negation. But I have a concept that I call negation as a mode of affirmation. What that means is it's really affirmation, but it takes on the form of negation, like critique. When somebody's critiquing you out of love, or like when I critique your papers or something, it may not be out of deep love, but part of the whole process of critique is I try to find some weaknesses to point them out, and I try to point it out in a kind of nice way without hurting your feelings, and people have done that to me, and then you make it better. You learn from your mistakes. Not all critique is just trying to be negative and be, put people down. So this is the tension. But Nietzsche, so there's this unprecedented tension of mind and spirit, which is on the verge of dissolving into contentment and ease. Now he's giving another. Only some people are feeling this tension as a kind of need and distress, a need to overcome this resentment towards life, and a distress that there's something wrong. I'm not living humanity is not living a full, rich existence here. Something's going wrong. That distress, that need. Nietzsche's feeling that, and he's trying to awaken us like a rooster awakening us in the morning. But what's happening, Nietzsche is saying, is right in the midst of this incredible tension. What tension? 2,500 years of Platonism, dogmatic Platonism, and this spiritual mental warfare that's been going on against Platonism, coming out of science and contemporary philosophy. That's creating this tension. In the midst of this tension, humanity is becoming docile and content, which is very different from happy for Nietzsche. It's sleeping right through it. So what he wants to do is come like a rooster, wake us up to this tension and to use that tension to move humanity beyond metaphysical dualism toward the overcoming of this reactive negation against life, and to create a species out of the human species that will say yes to life. For Nietzsche, the human species as a species, and that doesn't mean people individually here and there are not enjoying life and saying yes to life. It just means as a people, as a species, we've set our ideals above life, and we aspire towards that suprasensuous spiritual transcendence, and we miss life, which is perspective, it's perspectival, it's temporal, it's becoming, it's changing, and finite. So the future, if we could draw on this tension, could be radically transformed if philosophy were to take up its task and to rule. So he wants philosophy in this regard. One of Nietzsche's antipodes, who's the opposite of Nietzsche and who is one of his great enemies, is Plato. He's already mentioned dogmatic Platonism. But there's a lot of Plato in Nietzsche already. For example, Plato believed in the rule of philosophy, that philosophers should be rulers of the state. And Nietzsche is agreeing with that. It's just that they have two different views about what philosophy is and what its function is. So he uses a metaphor in the preface. Assuming truth were a woman, what then? He's using this as a metaphor. So if truth were a woman, then what so far has been the seduction of this woman and the courtship of this woman? Okay, so he's using a kind of courtly, romantic love metaphor. So let's say the philosopher is the lover of truth, and science loves truth. So, has philosophy and science won the heart of this truth? Well, Nietzsche, he says, no, humanity has hitherto lacked the sensitivity and strength of the seducer of truth, and has done her violence by being approached by suitors stripped of ego and personality, by disinterested investigators, science and philosophy among them, obsessed with the ideal of objective truth. what he's saying is this notion of disinterested engagement with reality in order to find the truth. By disinterested, he means without desire. And this notion of a selfless ego without prejudice, a pure subjectivity that can know pure objectivity. That very way of thinking has objectified truth. And truth is not an object. It's maybe the way a woman would feel when she's being objectified. So he's playing with that. A woman is not an object, and truth is not an object. So when we objectify truth, it's objectifying, it's making an object into something that's not an object, not merely an object. And that's what science does. When it looks at truth, it objectifies it. It separates between an object and a subject. And it presupposes that the subject is pure in the sense of there's no bias, which is impossible in principle. So what Nietzsche wants to do is bring back perspectivism, but it's not the same as relativism. This is an important distinction. And I know it sounds like just different words. They are different words, but the meaning is completely different. And the implications of relativism are deadly, because relativism means everybody has their own opinion and every opinion is of equal worth. So it depends on the situation about what is right and what is wrong. Well, one could justify then anything, right? If everybody has their own point of view, their own opinion about what's right and what's wrong, then all opinions are of equal worth. Well, Nietzsche's perspectivism is different from relativism. Perspectivism means that we're always doomed to a perspective. That's what's wrong with the seducer of truth here in his metaphor. The person who's trying to win over truth and know the truth is pretending to be disinterested, not without desires. But that's impossible in principle. There's always going to be a perspective. We can't climb out of our own skin, so we're going to always see things from a human point of view. And within that human point of view, it depends on our projects, on our mood, on our perspective, on our particular perspective or desires. That's going to change the way we see things. Now, after having said that, Nietzsche is not a relativist. He's not saying all perspectives are of equal value. Some are healthy, some are sick, some are deep, some are shallow, some are comprehensive, some are limited and one-sided. The big distinction is noble and base. And there is such a thing as an understanding of truth. So he's saying that we haven't won over the truth yet. We haven't found truth. For Nietzsche, truth is changing constantly because reality is changing. It's a ceaseless flow of novelty. Reality is a ceaseless flow of novelty. Every moment, no two moments are the same. It's the unfolding of the will to power. It just wants to grow. It just wants to live. It wants to survive and it wants to grow. Life does. It wants to survive and it wants to enhance itself, grow. Life is the will to power for Nietzsche. So some are life affirming, some are life negating. And this is the critical distinction for Nietzsche. Some perspectives are life negating, and he wants to attack those. That's negation as a mode of affirmation. So what is called for is an honest courtship, an eventual marriage between the truth seeker and truth, between humanity and life, which would generate types of people like offspring who will be life-affirming types of people in the future. So he's speaking generally. There have been these people throughout time, here and there. What he wants is a radical transformation in the very evolutionary history of humans. And that's going to take a radical approach to morality. Like I said right at the beginning, there's a intimate connection between morality and the future evolution of the human species. So, along with this marriage between humans and life, the truth seeker can indeed draw a reasonable inference about the way of all beings, which for Nietzsche is going to be the will to power. And along with this marriage, then, comes also the marriage between the human and human animal, the human animal. See, along with that bifurcation of Platonism came the separation of the human from the animal. Have you ever noticed that we make a distinction, don't we, when we talk? It's just part of common parlance. Like if I'm going to the zoo, I say, I'm going to the zoo to see the animals. Or if you watch a movie when somebody's criticizing someone and trying to, speak about this heinous crime that they've committed, they'll say the person is an animal, as though, as though there's something horrible about being an animal, right? That it's below human. But if we look in the mirror, we're animals too, right? But so where did that come from? That view that humans are not animals, and that to call somebody an animal is like the most horrible thing to call someone. Where did it come from? Well, it came from this metaphysical dualism because the human is pure spirit. It's an ego. It's a thinking thing. The animal is part of our bodies. That's according to metaphysical dualism. So that's not who you are. You're not your body. You're not your senses. You're not your animality. But when Nietzsche's talking about this overcoming of metaphysical dualism, this would be a reclaiming of human animality. And the Ubermensch, then, the one who's overcome this resentment towards life, inherent in metaphysical dualism, would then recover their animality and spiritualize their animality. There'd be a union between humanity and nature. There wouldn't have to be laws and customs that would try to preserve nature, because humans would naturally see themselves as part of nature, see nature as part of the human, and there'd be this symbiosis. Even the union between divinity and nature, to see nature as an emanation of divinity. And there's a section at the end of the preface where he speaks of hope. But it's a particular different kind of hope from the Christian notion of hope in an afterlife, in a better life than this one. He's talking about hope for the future evolution of the human species. Let us hope, he writes, that out of the ruins of Platonism, a philosophical edifice might be born worthy of millennia-long discipline. The task of modern humanity is not to repudiate the childish past, but to mature gracefully out of it, preserve whatever is life-affirming, but to negate the most dangerous of all errors so far. And then he names these errors: Plato's invention of the pure mind, that would be ego or I or my mind being pure in the sense of not being connected at all to anything material. Pure in the sense of no perspective. It's not a particular uh, perspective, but an absolute perspective seen from pure mind. That's the assumption. That's Plato's invention of a pure mind, the idea of a mind purified of all prejudices, and the assumption that a permanent, unchanging, unitary ground of all being can be discerned by this pure mind. Okay? That's the dogmatic part of it. Because skepticism usually comes on the heels of dogmatism and shows that this can't be the case. Now, in philosophy, there were two great skeptics who come in modern times, David Hume and Immanuel Kant, who prove that it's impossible to gain access to absolute reality. So the great Nietzsche is using these other philosophers. He knows about Hume and Kant, and they're part of that warfare against the 2,500 years of Platonism. Although in other respects, Kant is a Platonist. It's complicated, but in certain respects, when it comes to showing the dogmatism of dogmatism and leading us from dogmatism to skepticism, then Kant was working against Platonic uh, dogmatism. But in other regards, Kant is still a dogmatic Platonist in his two worldview. So let's not worry too much about Kant, but I mention him because we took a little look at Kant earlier. So Platonism has thus paved the way for the rule of religion over philosophy, and hence abandoned the great achievement of the pre-Socratic Enlightenment. That's another point he makes. So since dogmatic Platonism has grafted itself onto Christian theology, then the morality that comes from our Christianity has placed the rule of religion over philosophy. So faith rules over reason. Okay, think about that. Faith ruling over reason instead of reason ruling faith. If faith rules over reason, then you can believe in anything, right? Because you can always bring in this supernatural and say, well, you know, there's also the supernatural that defies reason, and that faith is predominant over reason. So that means religion is ruling philosophy. And what Nietzsche wants is philosophy to rule religion. Not that he wants to abolish religion, he just wants us to rethink what is the ruling factor. Should it be faith or should it be reason? From out of this long era, Western civilization has entered into the relief of a more healthy sleep. Again, we're sleeping through this. He calls the type of person who's living now and becoming predominant, he calls it the last man, in the sense of this person who's become obsessed with comforts and uh, complacency and no agitations and uh, sleeping right through the most important event, what he calls the death of God. So, in another book, a more literary work called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that's Nietzsche's greatest work. It's a literary work, but it's also philosophical. Zarathustra is the main character, and he claims God is dead. So that became a big expression in Nietzsche's philosophy. And Nietzsche has said it here and there, but what it means is very important. He doesn't mean atheism or anything. What he means is what's happening is the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has been shaped by millennia of dogmatic Platonism, the God that's put above the world, that is eternity above nature, the supra-sensuous above the sensuous, that is untenable now after the unfolding of modern philosophy and science. So God is dead. It just means that God, that notion of divinity, is defunct because there's an awareness now that's growing that it arises out of dualism, which is untenable, the separation between the suprasensuous and the sensuous, and the elevation of the sensuous above of the suprasensuous above the sensuous, and thereby the denigration of nature and the despiritualization of nature. So out of that resentment towards life grew this notion of the transcendent God that's not immanent, that's not implicit in nature. So that God has to go, Nietzsche thinks. But that doesn't mean that there is no God. It just means that that's an inadequate concept of God, a concept of God that's placed above the world and thereby spiritualizing the world. So we're sleeping right through this most important event of the death of God. But beyond the death of God, the phase of the war that has already been won remains the great task, the more subtle and even greater task to wake up to reality as it is in the midst of the rule of comforting opinion at the end of Platonism, which looks like the end of history. Thus, dogmatic Platonism is not only untrue, it is anti-truth and life-negating, for it stands truth on her head. More importantly, Platonism is also anti-life, for to speak of a pure mind and the good in itself denies the perspectival. So Nietzsche is a big adherent of or proponent of perspectivism, that there's no conception, no perception, no thought that's not finite and perspectival. We're always seeing something from a particular perspective. And like I said earlier, this is not relativism. It looks like relativism, but it's not. Relativism means all perspectives are of equal value. Everybody has their own opinion. Every opinion is of equal worth. If we're talking about morality, then there, everyone has their own opinion about what is right and wrong, so no one can say what is right and wrong. If we're talking about epistemology or knowledge, then everybody has their own opinion about what is true and what is untrue, so there's no such thing as truth or untruth. But Nietzsche rejects relativism, and he claims, to be sure, there's only perspectives. We can't get outside of our own perspective. But that doesn't mean that there are not comprehensive perspectives that can make claims about the total character of all beings. And that doesn't mean that all perspectives are of equal worth. Some are healthy, some are sick, some are the big thing is life affirming, life negating. Does this perspective arise out of resentment towards life, out of an inability to say yes to life because it involves suffering and change and passing? Or does it arise out of this awareness of suffering and change, but affirmation nonetheless? So is it affirmation or negation that's giving rise to this perspective? And then if it arises out of affirmation, Nietzsche embraces it, try to make it your own, because we want to be those persons who say yes to life. But if it arises out of resentment towards life, out of the will's ill will towards becoming and change, then he attacks it and tries to, negate the negation of life. So this magnificent tension of mind and spirit as Europe sleeps on thinking that the crucial war is over. So he imagines, as I said earlier, this tension as a bow drawn taut that can launch an arrow into the most distant future. The taut bow is a frequent metaphor from Heraclitus, one of Nietzsche's most influential predecessors, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher who talks about the opposite forces giving energy, that that everything arises out of the interplay with its opposite. So this tension, Nietzsche is saying, can be a good thing. This 2,500 years of Platonism and the war against it has created this tension. Now we can let the arrow fly and shoot toward the goal, which is the overcoming of metaphysical dualism. He mentions toward the end two attempts to, in the grand style, to unbend the bow. And he mentions Jesuitism, which is like the most intellectual approach to Christian spirituality, and he mentions Pascal, who fought against Jesuitism, and he speaks of Pascal Pascal had this idea that reason has that there are matters of the heart that can't be understood by reason. That reason has reasons for concealing its reasons when it comes to matters of the heart. So there's this character called Pascal. You don't have to get into that too much. It's just that he thinks that's quite important that Pascal fought against this element in Jesuitism, which would have us pass over this great tension. The other one that probably rubs us the wrong, or some people the wrong way, depends who you are, liberal democracy, which he saw um, spreading over Europe, and as the monarchs were falling and uh, the republics were taking their place, some of these republics, like the United States, the Republic of the United States, have tried to develop a democratic republic, which Nietzsche was opposed to. And that too puts him in line with Plato, who didn't have much trust in democracy. So he thinks liberal democracy is also an attempt to um, uh, slacken the tension of this great overcoming that's possible when we rethink morality. So instead of identifying with any kind of national democratic state, Nietzsche speaks of the good European, which sort of anticipates the European Union. And I think he's using it. Well, what Nietzsche means by the good European is a completely big issue. There's a whole book written on that. I just found the good Europeans, and so I don't want to get into that right now without approaching it more carefully. But for now, know that Nietzsche is speaking of it in a positive way, and it's his way of getting some distance from liberal democracy and nationalism, especially German nationalism was on the rise when Nietzsche was, and anti-Semitism was on the rise, and Nietzsche was opposed to anti-Semitism. That's a documented fact now. Even though the first wave of Nietzsche scholarship was all Nazi propaganda, generated by his sister Elizabeth, and after Nietzsche had passed away, Elizabeth has Adolf Hitler come to the Nietzsche archives, and then Hitler uses Nietzsche's philosophy as the basis of his Third Reich ideology. All that is all propaganda, all twisted around by his sister, by the Nazi Party, and all that now by Nietzsche scholars, it's seen to be what it is, just forgeries and distortions. But Nietzsche was definitely against anti-Semitism, and perhaps also narrow, he writes, the task, and who knows, the goal. The goal, the way I see it, is that humankind would evolve beyond this metaphysical being, this last man, and it would overcome the last man and become Ubermensch. That there would be the rule of philosophy, and the Ubermensch would be produced out of this great tension of 2,500 years of Platonism and the war against it. So these are the big ideas that he's dealing with in this book. What I want to do with you is cover just one chapter with you, given the short time we have with each of these philosophers. So let's take chapter 5, and I'll try to pull out the main themes of chapter 5. Nietzsche wrote many works on morality. Some are more systematic than others. He's not doing like Kant, for example. He's not creating a system of moral philosophy. He's approaching it more as a free thinker. Some of his books on morality are very systematic, like on the genealogy of morals. There's 3 essays, they fit together perfectly, and he shows, the history of morality. This chapter 5 of Beyond Good and Evil is one of Nietzsche's most mature expressions of moral philosophy in all of his works. So if we take that chapter, I think we'll get a good glimpse of his moral philosophy. Okay, thank you.